A folded newspaper lies on a kitchen table in a Southern American town sometime in 1959. The paper is soft at the creases from being opened and refolded more than once, and the ink on the uppermost page carries the particular dry smell of a press that ran through the night. Near the bottom of the page, below the grocery advertisements and above the weather column, there is a short block of dense print. It is not a headline story. It occupies the kind of space that newspapers of that era reserved for items that were interesting but not urgent. A column of perhaps 300 words, set in a slightly smaller typeface than the surrounding text. Its subject a story about a young couple, a parked car, and a hook found hanging from the door handle on the passenger side. The paper sits still. The house around it is quiet. Somewhere in the same town, the same story is being passed between two people in a conversation that will leave no record at all. This is approximately where the written history of the Hook legend begins, though the story itself is older than any printed version of it. Folklorists who have spent careers tracing the movement of oral narratives through American communities have documented versions of the Hook story circulating by word of mouth as early as 1953, moving through communities across the American South and Midwest in the way that certain stories move, not as news, not quite as rumor, but as something that people recognized as belonging to a shared register of things that were understood to be true about the world, or at least to contain something true about the world, even if the specific details shifted depending on who was telling it and where they were sitting when they did. The 1959 newspaper appearance is the earliest traceable moment at which someone set the story down in print in a form that could be kept and consulted and passed along without the participation of a human voice. It is a modest beginning for a legend that would eventually reach tens of millions of people. The column is small. The story inside it is small. The couple parks on a dark road. A radio broadcast interrupts the music with a warning about an escaped killer with a hook for a hand. The couple leaves. Later, at home, they find the hook caught in the door handle, evidence that the killer was close, that he had already reached for the car, and that the decision to leave had been made in the only moment in which it would have done any good. That structure, that sequence of events, that specific arrangement of warning and near miss and physical evidence found after the danger has passed. This was already, by 1959, a story with a history. The newspaper column did not create it. It recorded something that was already moving through rooms and telephone conversations and the particular social spaces where teenagers gathered in the years after the Second World War. The printed version simply held still long enough to be dated and cited. What is worth noting about the 1959 appearance, beyond the fact of its existence, is what surrounds it on the page: the advertisements, the weather report, the ordinary texture of a weekday morning in a mid-sized southern town. The Hook story sits inside that ordinary texture without announcement, as if it belongs there, as if it requires no special framing or explanation. No editorial note explains what kind of story this is or why the paper is printing it. It is placed where it is placed, and the reader is left to make of it what they will. The story's first verifiable, large-scale distribution came on November 8th, 1960, in an altogether different kind of publication. On that Tuesday morning, a version of the Hook story appeared in the nationally syndicated column Dear Abby, written by Pauline Phillips under the pen name Abigail Van Buren. The column ran in hundreds of newspapers simultaneously. The readership was not a single town or a single region, but an estimated tens of millions of people spread across every state in the country. People who had never heard the story before, people who had heard it already in some local oral variant, people in cities and in rural communities, and in the kind of mid-sized American towns where the story had been quietly circulating for the better part of a decade. All of them encountered it on the same morning, in the same words, in the same position on their local newspaper page. The effect of that simultaneous national distribution is not a small thing to consider. A story that had been moving through overlapping local communities, changing slightly with each telling, adapting to local geography and local anxieties and the particular social dynamics of each setting in which it was told. That story was, on November 8th, 1960, suddenly everywhere at once. The Dear Abby column carried a version of the Hook story that was specific and confident in its details, set down in the authoritative register of a nationally recognized advice column, and placed in front of a readership that had been trained to trust that register. It was, in one Tuesday morning, both confirmed and amplified, both given credibility and given scale. The copies came off the presses in city after city. The same column, the same typeface, the same position on the page. A family in Ohio opened their morning paper. A school secretary in Missouri folded hers to the right page before the first bell. A woman in Texas read it at the kitchen table while the coffee was still hot. None of them were reading something new, exactly. Each of them was reading something that felt, depending on their prior exposure to it, either like a story they already knew or like the confirmation of a story they had half known. By noon on November 8th, 1960, the Hook story had become a national cultural fact. There is a particular kind of change that happens when a story moves from oral circulation to wide print distribution, and it is not simply a change of scale. A story that travels by word of mouth is by its nature in motion. Every telling reshapes it slightly. Every teller makes small adjustments, moving the road, changing the radio broadcaster's voice, adding or removing a detail of the car or the night or the moment of discovery. The story is alive in a specific way, responsive to its teller and its audience, shaped by the social context of each particular transmission. A story that appears in a nationally syndicated newspaper column is by contrast fixed. It has a version. It has an author, or at least an attributed author. It has a date, and a place, and a printing, and those things give it a kind of authority that oral transmission cannot provide, and a kind of rigidity that oral transmission would never impose. What the Dear Abby column did then was not simply spread the story, it anchored it. It gave the Hook legend a version to return to, a fixed reference point against which all the local oral variants could be measured or compared. It is partly for this reason that November 8th, 1960 remains the date most frequently cited when scholars and journalists trace the Hook story's history, not because that was the day the story began, but because that was the day it became impossible to be entirely certain it had not been everywhere all along. The formal scholarly treatment of the Hook legend came 2 decades later in the work of Jan Harold Brunvand, a folklorist at the University of Utah, whose 1981 book, The Vanishing Hitchhiker, brought the academic study of urban legends to a general readership that had not previously known there was such a study to be had. Brunvand identified the Hook story as one of the defining examples of the American urban legend, not simply because of how widely it had circulated or how long it had persisted, but because of how cleanly it demonstrated certain features that scholars had come to recognize as characteristic of the form. Among those features, the one Brunvand discussed with particular attention was what he called the friend of a friend pattern. The Hook story In essentially every variant collected by folklorists across several decades, was told as something that had happened not to the teller, but to someone connected to the teller, a cousin, a classmate, a girl who went to another school in the same district, a woman whose sister had been the passenger in the parked car. This pattern of attribution is not accidental, and it is not simply a matter of storytelling convention. It places the event at exactly the right social distance from the teller, close enough to claim personal knowledge, far enough to avoid the burden of direct testimony. The story happened to someone real, someone with a name and a location, and a connection to the teller's own life. But that person is never present to confirm or contradict the details. Brunvand found this pattern repeated in his collected variants, with a consistency that was itself significant. It was not just that the Hook story often used the friend of a friend attribution, it was that the Hook story almost always used it, across regions and decades, in the accounts of tellers who had no knowledge of each other and no awareness that the attribution pattern was a pattern at all. They simply told the story the way it had come to them, and the way it had come to them was through the same social mechanism: the friend's cousin, the neighbor's daughter, the girl from the other side of town. The Vanishing Hitchhiker appeared in 1981, but Brunvand had been collecting and analyzing these stories for years before the book was published, and the fieldwork it drew on had been ongoing through the 1970s. Some of what Brunvand brought into formal academic discussion had been circulating in more limited scholarly channels for years. The observation that the Hook story was geographically widespread, that it showed remarkable narrative stability across its many variants, that it clustered around specific social settings and specific kinds of tellers. What his book did was gather that scattered scholarly attention and present it in a form that the general reader could encounter and find useful, placing the Hook legend and stories like it in a frame that was curious rather than dismissive, interested in what the stories meant and where they came from, rather than simply noting that they were not strictly true. One of the things Brunvand's research made visible was the geography of the Hook legend's earliest regional circulation. The specific Lover's Lane locations named in early variants of the story were not imaginary or generically remote. They were real roads, gravel roads, mostly, running alongside fields or through stands of trees at the edges of small and mid-sized towns, the kind of roads that every high school student in the district knew by name and that existed on no official map with any name at all. Roads outside communities in Texas, in Missouri, in Ohio, roads whose local names had been assigned informally by the teenagers who used them in the years after the war, when car ownership became something a young person could aspire to rather than simply wait for. These roads were, in most cases, a specific distance from the nearest adult supervision, close enough that a car could reach them in a few minutes from the school parking lot or the drive-in, far enough that a parked car was not visible from any house or intersection where a parent or a teacher or a policeman might pass. The precise calibration of that distance was understood by the teenagers who chose these roads, understood in the practiced, detailed way that people understand the geography of their own social lives. The roads were known, the distance was known, and when the Hook story was told in those communities, the road named in it was, very often, the road those teenagers used themselves. There is something worth sitting with for a moment in that detail. The early regional variants of the Hook story did not place the couple on a generically dark road in a generically remote location. They placed them on a road with a name, a road with local associations, a road that the teller and the audience both knew, not from a map, but from the specific shared knowledge of people who had grown up in the same place and understood the same unspoken geography of their own town. The story was not set somewhere else, it was set here. It happened to people like us. It happened on a road we have been on. This is, in a sense, one of the mechanisms by which the friend of a friend pattern does its work. The story is close, the people in it are adjacent to the teller's own life. The road it happened on is the road the teller knows. All of this proximity serves the same function. It keeps the story in the register of something that could be true, something that is true about a world the listener already inhabits, rather than something that happened far away and long ago, and therefore safely elsewhere. Brunvan's fieldwork records the experience of encountering these locally specific variants with the particular quality of detail that comes from collecting oral accounts directly from the people who told or heard them. A folklorist sitting across a kitchen table from a middle-aged woman in the 1970s, listening to her recall the night she first heard the Hook story at a slumber party when she was 14 years old. The woman remembering not only the story but the teller of the story, a classmate usually, or a slightly older girl who had an air of authority about her, and the road that was named in it, and the way the name of the road had landed in the room when it was spoken. The specificity of those memories, collected decades after the events they describe, says something about the way the Hook story lodged itself in the people who encountered it in those early years. The woman at the kitchen table in the 1970s has not forgotten the road's name. She has not forgotten who told the story. She remembers the room and the dark outside the window and the quality of the silence that followed the end of the telling. What she is remembering is not just a story. She is remembering an experience, a specific social event with a specific texture, located in a specific place at a specific age. This quality of attached memory, the way the story comes wrapped in the circumstances of its telling, is one of the features that distinguish urban legends from other forms of narrative. A myth or a folk tale is understood to belong to everyone and to no particular moment of transmission. An urban legend comes with a provenance. It came from someone. It was told somewhere. The conditions of its arrival are part of its content, and the Hook story, in its earliest regional circulation, arrived in conditions that were themselves particular and locally specific. The slumber party, the darkened room, the girls arranged on sleeping bags on the floor, the windows showing only black, the story told by someone who had heard it from someone who had been on that road, or knew someone who had. These conditions were not simply the backdrop to the story. They were part of what made the story work, part of what gave it the quality of something almost true, something close enough to touch. The folklorists who collected these oral accounts noted something else about the Hook legend's early regional period that is worth examining at some length. In some of the earliest variants, particularly those collected from communities in Texas, the story did not include a hook at all. The couple parked on the dark road. The radio warning came. They drove away quickly, and when they arrived home and looked at the car in the light, what they found was not a hook hanging from the door handle, but a set of claw marks along the lower edge of the car door. Curved scratch marks in the paint, the width and depth of a hand-sized implement, as if something with a sharpened, curved tool had dragged it across the metal in the seconds before the car pulled away. This is a small variation, the difference between a hook caught on a door handle and claw marks scratched into the door's surface, and yet it is, in terms of what the story is doing, a meaningful one. The hook caught in the handle is evidence of an interrupted act. It tells the couple and the listener that the killer reached the car, grabbed the handle, and lost his hook when the car pulled away too suddenly for him to release it. The claw marks are something different. They are evidence of proximity and intention, the marks of a hand or a tool dragged along the car's surface. But they do not tell a story of quite the same interrupted grasp. They are, if anything, more ambiguous. They say something was here, something was this close. But exactly what happened in the moment those marks were made is left open. Brungs and others who have studied the early Texas variants have noted that the claw marks version may represent the story in a state before it had settled into its most stable form. The hook detail is both more specific and more satisfying as narrative resolution, a single dramatic portable piece of physical evidence that does not require interpretation. A hook is unmistakably a hook. Claw marks could, in a bright enough light, be explained as something else. The story that circulated most widely, that traveled farthest from its regional origins, that eventually reached the Dear Abby column in 1960, and the national readership that read it on that November morning, was the story with the hook. The version with the claw marks stayed closer to home, circulating in communities where it had found its audience, and gradually faded from the record as the hook version became the dominant form. This negotiation between versions, this process by which a story gradually finds the form that travels best, is in some respects the most interesting part of the hook legend's early history. The story did not arrive complete. It was assembled over time across multiple tellings by people who had no awareness that they were participating in the construction of something that would eventually be identified as a defining example of American urban legend. They were simply telling a story the way it had come to them, adjusting the details that felt wrong or weak, keeping the details that felt right, passing it along to someone who would do the same. The gravel road in rural Texas in the late 1950s, the couple in the parked car, the radio, the warning, the sudden decision to leave, the drive home in silence, and then the walk around the car in the light from the porch, and the thing found on the door that should not have been there. In some tellings it was a hook, in some it was claw marks. In some, the radio warning came from a local station with a name the listeners recognized. In some, the road had a name. In others, the couple was specific. A girl from a particular family, a boy who drove a particular car. And in others, they were anonymous. Every couple who had ever parked on a dark road and made the decision to stay a little longer. The story was still finding its shape. The people who told it were still deciding what it was, the details that would eventually become fixed. The hook, the handle, the clean evidence of the near miss were not yet settled, not yet agreed upon, not yet the version that would travel from community to community across the country, and eventually from decade to decade across the century. What had been settled in those early years of regional circulation was the structure, the couple on the dark road, the external warning, the retreat, the evidence discovered after the danger had passed. That structure was consistent across the variants, even when the specific details shifted. The claw marks and the hook are different objects, but they occupy the same structural position in the story. They are the thing found afterward. They are the proof that the danger was real, that the decision to leave was the right decision, that something was indeed out there in the dark at the edge of the road where the car had been parked. And the story, in those early years, was still being handed from one person to another across the small distances of community life. A name on a gravel road, a girl at a slumber party, a kitchen table in a southern town, where a folded newspaper lies soft at the creases, the hook story near the bottom of the page, the ink still faintly carrying the smell of the press. The detail of those early Texas variants, where the couple came home and found only marks and no hook, carries a particular quality that the more settled version of the story does not quite share. The claw marks are ambiguous in a way that the hook is not. They suggest that something was close, something reached the car, something left a mark, but they do not answer every question. They leave a small gap. What made those marks? Whether the car left in time or only seemed to. Whether the marks were new or whether they had been there, unnoticed, for some time before that night. A chrome door handle in the early morning light is an ordinary object. It catches the sun in the way that metal catches the sun. Bright and immediate, not holding warmth, not holding anything. Along its lower edge, if someone looks carefully, there might be a small crescent-shaped scratch in the paint, the kind of mark that accumulates on any car that has been driven and parked and opened and closed across a handful of years. A mark that could have been made by a ring or a coat button or a set of keys, or by something else on a different kind of night, on a dark road at the edge of a town where the trees grow close to the gravel and the radio sometimes picks up a station from far away. The story had not yet decided what left that mark. The people telling it were still working that out, still testing the versions against each other, still finding their way toward the form that would eventually settle and travel and reach on a Tuesday morning in November of 1960, a kitchen table in every state in the country at once. But in those early years, in the communities where the Hook story first moved through rooms and conversations, and the particular social geography of teenage life in post-war American towns, the story was still open, still being decided, still in the hands of the people who were making it, one telling at a time, without quite knowing that was what they were doing. The claw marks are still there, in those early variants, if one looks for them. A record of the story in a state before it found its final shape, before the hook became the hook, and the handle became the handle, and the near miss became the clean, portable, nationally distributable story that would persist across 7 decades without losing its essential outline. The story was still being written then, not by anyone in particular, by everyone who told it, and by everyone who listened, and by the distance between those two things, the gap between what the teller said and what the listener carried away, which is where a legend actually lives and where it continues to move, quietly, from one room to the next. A used car lot in a mid-sized American city in the summer of 1955 had a particular smell in the afternoon, warm metal and oil and the faint, dry sweetness of rubber left out in the sun. The cars stood in long rows, their paint catching the light in broad, clean planes, chrome trim bright enough to throw small reflections onto the neighboring vehicles. Under each windshield wiper, tucked flat against the glass, sat a handwritten price card in black ink on white cardstock, the numbers large and deliberate, written by someone who understood that the number had to be readable from the curb. A teenager passing the lot on a Saturday afternoon could stop and read every card in the front row without touching a single car. On a summer job's wages, a few dollars an hour at a grocery or a gas station, some of those numbers were not entirely impossible. That accessibility was new. It was genuinely historically new. In 1945, the United States had approximately 25 million registered vehicles on its roads. By 1960, that number had grown to more than 60 million. The factories that had spent 4 years building military equipment had turned back to civilian production with enormous efficiency, and the economic conditions of the post-war decade made automobile ownership available to households and individuals who would not have considered it realistic in any prior generation. What this meant in practical terms was that teenagers, for the first time in large numbers, had access to cars, not as passengers, not as occasional borrowers, but as regular drivers of their own or their family's vehicles. The parked car, in the late afternoon and evening hours, became a space that belonged almost entirely to them. The word that people would later use for this was freedom. The word that parents and community leaders and church councils tended to use in the written record of the period was something closer to danger. Both words were pointing at the same thing. The drive-in theater made the situation more specific. In 1948, there were approximately 820 drive-in theaters operating across the United States. By 1958, that number had grown to roughly 4,063, spread across every region of the country, concentrated most densely in the South and the Midwest, where land was available and summer evenings were warm and long. The drive-in was a public space that was also, practically speaking, almost entirely private. Each car sat enclosed within its own small territory. The speakers hooked to the rolled-down windows meant that the sound arrived personally, close to the ear, not broadcast into a shared hall. The screen was visible from the highway, enormous and lit, but what happened inside each car was invisible from the outside, separated from adjacent cars by the open air and the understood protocol of looking forward. Popular media had a name for this, used consistently enough that it appears in newspaper columns, magazine articles, and public speeches throughout the decade. The phrase was passion pits. It appeared without quotation marks in enough context to suggest that it had stopped feeling like slang and had simply become descriptive. Early variants of the hook legend placed the couple not at a drive-in, but at a lover's lane, a stretch of road, or a park path, or a gravel turnout associated in local knowledge with teenagers parking at night. The two settings were functionally interchangeable in the story's logic, and in some versions they were explicitly collapsed together. The important element was the car. The car was the room. The car was the place where the story happened. What the drive-in theaters and the lovers' lanes shared, beyond their association with teenagers and automobiles, was their relationship to the organized social life of American communities in the 1950s. The chaperone dance, the church social, the school event, these were spaces that adults could see into and to some degree govern. The parked car was a space they could not. This was noticed. The response to it was not subtle, and the historical record of that response is still readable in the archives of churches, schools, and civic organizations from the period. A church bulletin board in a Midwestern town in 1958 might carry, alongside the announcements of choir practice times and committee meeting schedules, a typed notice from the parish council. The language in such notices was careful. It addressed parents rather than teenagers directly, which was a choice that reflected both the assumed hierarchy of moral authority and the practical acknowledgement that teenagers were not the primary audience for church bulletin boards. The content was straightforward. Parents were urged to know the whereabouts of their children on weekend evenings, to understand that unsupervised car dates presented specific temptations that more structured social environments did not, and to consider whether the freedoms their children were being given were commensurate with the maturity required to use them wisely. The anxiety underneath this language was entirely plain, even when the language itself was restrained. The notice was not warning parents about a specific event or a specific individual. It was warning them about a situation, a configuration of privacy and darkness and youth that the parish council had collectively decided was in itself a problem. These notices appeared in Catholic and Protestant parishes alike. They appeared in school newsletters and in the publications of parent-teacher associations. They appeared in the advice columns of women's magazines and in the op-ed pages of local newspapers. The concern was not fringe or marginal. It was, in the documentary record of the decade, something closer to consensus. In 1955, a Senate subcommittee, chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver, convened hearings on the subject of juvenile delinquency. The hearings produced testimony from educators, law enforcement officials, psychiatrists, and social workers, and they received substantial press coverage at the time. 1 year earlier, in 1954, a psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham had published a book called Seduction of the Innocent, which argued that comic books were a primary driver of delinquent behavior in American youth. Wortham's methods have since been extensively criticized, and his conclusions have not held up well against later scrutiny. At the time, though, the book was widely discussed and contributed to a Senate investigation into the comic book industry. Taken together, the Kefauver hearings and Wortham's book established something in public discourse that was less a specific claim than a general framework. The framework held that American teenagers were at risk, not from poverty or from the residual traumas of a war many of their parents had fought, but from cultural environments that offered stimulation without moral guidance. The parked car in this framework was simply one version of the same problem. Scholars who have studied the folklore of this period have noted that the concerns shaping public discourse in the 1950s were not only about teenagers. The Cold War produced a specific variety of ambient anxiety that is difficult to characterize precisely because it did not always attach itself to specific articulable threats. The Soviet nuclear program was real, and the possibility of large-scale destruction was genuinely present in the minds of people who had recently lived through a war, but the anxiety it generated was in some ways too large and too diffuse to be processed as a specific fear. Folklorists including Jan Harold Brunvand and Gary Allen Fine, writing in the decades that followed, argued that urban legends of the 1950s and 1960s frequently served as containers for this kind of diffuse anxiety, giving it a specific local narratable shape so that it could be articulated, shared, and managed at the level of ordinary social exchange. An escaped killer at the edge of town was frightening in a way that was concrete and bounded. The threat had a location. It had a potential encounter. It had a resolution, however grim. This made it, in a particular sense, more manageable than the fear of something that had no edges. This does not mean that the Hook legend was consciously invented to serve this function. Stories do not emerge from committee decisions. They emerge from the intersection of particular circumstances and particular needs in ways that no individual teller fully controls or intends. What the folklorists were noting was not a conspiracy, but a pattern, the observable tendency of frightening stories to arise and persist in communities where fear is already present in diffuse forms, and to take shapes that fit closely with the specific social anxieties those communities were already navigating. In the 1950s, those anxieties were strikingly specific. The teenager in the parked car was not only a source of moral concern to adults. The teenager was also, in some sense, a symbol of a larger unease about the pace and shape of post-war American life. The prosperity that felt precarious, the freedoms that felt dangerous, the new consumer culture that offered pleasures whose costs were not immediately obvious. The car was the most potent symbol of all of this, desirable, liberating, and potentially lethal. A machine that gave its occupants an almost complete independence from the structures that had previously organized social life. Placing a killer at the edge of that space, outside the window of the parked car, unable to fully enter but undeniably present, was in narrative terms an almost elegant solution to the problem of articulating a fear that otherwise resisted concrete expression. The high school gymnasium in this period occupied an interesting position in the social landscape. A chaperoned school dance was, from the perspective of community institutions, the controlled version of the adolescent social space, supervised, bounded, temporally limited, visible to adults. Photographs of such events from the mid 1950s show the punch bowl attended by teachers or parent volunteers, the streamers hung from the ceiling, the couples dancing in the careful way that chaperone dancing required. Outside, in the parking lot, the situation was different. The parking lot was not the gymnasium. The parking lot was dark. The adults inside could not see it. The understood tension between the two spaces, the lit gymnasium and the dark lot adjacent to it, was not accidental and was not invisible to anyone present. Both teenagers and the adults supervising them were aware of it, though they operated from different positions relative to it. The Hook story in its earliest versions was not placed in a gymnasium, it was placed in the parking lot. It was placed specifically in the car, in the space that existed precisely because the supervised space could not contain everything that adolescent social life required. The story did not say that the car was dangerous because teenagers were behaving badly inside it. But it said the car was dangerous because something from outside was trying to get in. The moral structure of this is worth pausing over without pressing it into any particular conclusion. The couple inside the car in the story are typically not doing anything that invites explicit condemnation. They are simply there, together, in the dark. The threat arrives from outside, not from within. And yet the story was frequently told by adults to teenagers as a reason not to park, which suggests that the threat arriving from outside was being understood, at least in part, as a consequence of the situation inside. This is the kind of narrative maneuver that stories can accomplish quietly without announcing themselves as moral arguments. The Hook legend never said, "Teenagers who park in isolated locations deserve what happens to them." It did not need to say this. The structure said it, in the way that story structures communicate without requiring explicit statement. Community institutions understood this, at least intuitively. A church council warning notice and a ghost story told at a slumber party were not the same thing, and they arrived through entirely different channels and in entirely different tones. But they were, in a sense, pointing in the same direction. Both were orienting teenagers toward the same dark, empty parking lot at the edge of town and saying, "Something is out there." The notice was saying it in formal language addressed to parents. The story was saying it in a whisper in a darkened living room addressed directly to the people most likely to end up in the car. The decade's car culture had a specific geography. The used car lot was one part of it, the point of acquisition, the threshold of access. The drive-in was another, the quasi-public space where the car's privacy was simultaneously acknowledged and organized. The lover's lane was the third, the space that existed entirely outside the organizational reach of community institutions, known locally but never formally named, accessible by car and by car alone, used after dark and only after dark. The names of these roads varied by community. They were known by their informal designations, names that every teenager in the school district would have recognized immediately and that would have meant nothing to anyone outside the district. A road outside a high school in rural Texas in the late 1950s might have had a name known to every student and to no adult who had not grown up in that town. The Hook story, in its local variants, was often placed on a road with precisely that character, a road the teller could name, a road the listener would know, a road whose local specificity was part of the story's claim to authenticity. This specificity was not incidental. It was, in fact, one of the legend's primary mechanisms for establishing credibility. The story happened not in a vague somewhere, but in a specific place with a specific local name, which meant it happened in the teller's world, in the geography they moved through, in the roads they knew. The distance between the story and the listener's own experience was narrowed to the distance between the named road and wherever they were sitting when they heard it. The automobile transformed American adolescence in more ways than the simple provision of transportation. It transformed the scale of social life. Teenagers who had previously been limited to the social geography of their immediate neighborhood or their walking range could now move across the whole spread of a county in an evening. Drive-ins drew from catchment areas that spanned multiple towns. To lovers' lanes served teenagers from high schools that sat 10 or 15 miles apart. The social world of the American teenager in 1958 was, in geographic terms, significantly larger than it had been for any previous generation of young Americans, and the car was the reason. This expansion had consequences that were mostly ordinary: wider social networks, more varied social experiences, a loosening of the neighborhood-based social hierarchies that had previously organized teenage life. It also had the consequence that teenagers were, on any given weekend evening, more often in places their parents did not know, more often beyond the range of any adult supervision, and more often in circumstances that community institutions could see from a distance but could not reach. The anxiety this generated was real, and it was not unreasonable. It was also, in its public expression, sometimes disproportionate, a point that can be made without condemnation, simply by noting that the documented harms of teenage car culture in this period were considerably smaller than the volume of institutional concern would suggest. The juvenile delinquency panic of the mid-1950s was, in retrospect, a response less to a statistical reality than to a set of symbolic changes, visible evidence that the social order was reorganizing itself in ways that the established institutions of community life had not designed and could not fully govern. The car was one of those changes. Rock and roll was another. The drive-in was a third. Each one represented a form of adolescent life that was visible to adults but not controlled by them, pleasurable to teenagers in ways that existing supervised social structures could not match, and sufficiently new that it had not yet developed the informal norms and community understandings that older social forms had accumulated over time. Urban legends in this context were not separate from the institutional responses. They were a parallel channel, faster, more intimate, less formal, and in certain respects more effective. A typed notice on a church bulletin board reached the parents who attended that church on the Sunday they saw it. The hook story, moving through oral transmission from one slumber party or school hallway conversation to the next, reached teenagers directly in the spaces they already occupied, in the social currency they already trusted. Peers carried it, not authority figures. This meant it arrived without the automatic resistance that teenage social identity typically generates in response to explicit adult instruction. The story was also crucially entertaining. It produced a specific pleasant sensation, the mild, manageable fear of a narrative that threatened harm to people who were not the teller or the immediate listener, set in a place close enough to be credible but not identical to the teller's exact location, resolved in a way that allowed the listeners to go home safely. Whatever moral instruction it may have carried was delivered alongside a social experience, the darkened room, the dropped voice, the collective response that made the entire transmission feel less like instruction and more like belonging. This combination of social function and narrative pleasure is part of what the institutional warnings could not replicate. A typed notice on a bulletin board could convey the concern. It could not produce the experience of having that concern delivered in a whisper by a peer in a dark room, with everyone present responding to it together. The America of the 1950s was not only a moral panic, it was also a genuinely expansive place, full of material abundance and social possibility, and the specific optimism of a society that had recently survived an enormous collective ordeal and was now, with varying degrees of success, trying to build something ordinary and stable. The used car lots and the drive-in theaters were part of this pleasure built for ordinary people on a scale that earlier decades had not managed. The high school, with its gymnasium and its darkened parking lot, was part of this too. The Hook story, circulating through the social networks of teenagers who had access to cars for the first time and were navigating a social landscape that their parents had not quite experienced, was a product of all of it. It carried the era's specific anxieties about unsupervised spaces, about the limits of parental authority, about what happened in the dark at the edge of town. It carried them in a form that was portable and social and pleasurable, that could move from one town to the next without losing its essential shape, that could be adapted to local geographies without losing its essential meaning. The Kefauver hearings produced transcripts. Wortham's book produced controversy and eventually a comics code. The church bulletin board notice produced perhaps a few evenings of parental conversation. The Hook story produced, in the people who carried it, a feeling, quiet, particular, slightly pleasant in its very mild unease, of knowing that the dark parking lot at the edge of town was a place with a story attached to it. The two things, the institutional response and the narrative response, were not competing with each other in the sense of one winning and one losing. They were operating on different registers, reaching different audiences through different channels, accomplishing some overlapping and some entirely distinct ends. What the church notice was attempting through explicit instruction, the Hook story was accomplishing through narrative structure, both pointing in their separate ways toward the same unlit stretch of road, the same parked car, the same darkened window, the same uncomfortable possibility that something outside the car might have noticed the people inside it. In the language of the notice, this possibility was framed as a moral risk arising from the choices of the people in the car. In the language of the story, it was framed as an external threat arriving from a figure already defined as dangerous before he ever reached the car door. The two framings are not the same, and the difference between them is interesting enough to notice without pressing further, simply to observe that the same dark parking lot at the edge of town could carry two quite different kinds of meaning depending on who was doing the pointing and how. The decade ended. The drive-in theaters continued. The cars multiplied. The Hook story moved forward with them, carried by the teenagers of the 1950s into the 1960s, and then passed along in the way that useful stories are always passed along, to the next generation of people who would eventually find themselves parked somewhere quiet and dark, with the engine off and the windows slightly down, and the particular stillness of a late evening settling around the car from all directions. The story would be waiting, as it had been for years, to say what it had always been saying, which was, at its simplest, that the dark outside the car was not entirely empty. The bulletin board notice aged and was eventually taken down and replaced. The story did not age in the same way. It moved instead, through the decades and through the social structures of succeeding generations, adapting its surface details as it went, while its central situation, the car, the couple, the dark, the thing just outside the window, held remarkably steady. What the notice was trying to accomplish through instruction, the story accomplished through something closer to atmosphere, the specific quiet, widely shared sense that a parked car at the edge of town, however ordinary it looked in the afternoon, was not quite the same place in the dark. A stretch of road outside Texarkana ran close between the trees on both sides, the gravel pale in the early spring light, the branches not yet fully leafed, so that the sky came through in long broken patches overhead. In February of 1946, that road was quiet in the way roads are quiet before anything has happened on them, before any particular night has been attached to them in memory, before any name for what occurred there had been agreed upon. The trees were loblolly pines, mostly, and the ground beneath them was soft with old needles. At that hour, before the newspapers arrived, before the town had assembled its account of what it had learned, the road was only a road. What happened in and around Texarkana between February and May of 1946 was recorded in careful language by the regional press as the attacks occurred, each new report adding a detail or correcting the one before it. The coverage growing denser as the spring advanced and the crimes continued, and the person responsible was not found. An unknown attacker, referred to in contemporary reports and in later accounts as the Phantom Killer, targeted young couples in isolated locations at night, approaching parked cars on dark roads at the edge of town. 8 people were attacked across that span of months. 5 of them died. The case was never solved. The Phantom Killer was never identified, never arrested, never given a name beyond the one the newspapers supplied, and the file containing what investigators assembled over decades remains open in the official sense of that word, meaning simply that no conclusion was ever reached, that the investigation arrived at a border beyond which the facts did not extend. The national press followed the Texarkana attacks through the spring and into summer, and the coverage was wide enough that communities far outside Texas knew the outline of the case before the year was out. That kind of coverage in 1946 moved through a particular set of channels: the wire services, the regional papers that picked up wire copy, the radio broadcasts that condensed further, and what arrived in other towns was an outline, a shape, the essential elements of the scenario, rather than the texture of the specific place. Young couples, parked cars, remote roads, an attacker who was never found. Those were the elements that traveled, and they traveled in a form already slightly simplified from the original, already slightly generalized, already beginning the long process by which a specific event in a specific place becomes something that feels as though it could have happened anywhere. Folklorists who have written about the Hook legend and its possible origins have returned to Texarkana more than once. Jan Harold Brunvand, whose 1981 work on American urban legends documented the Hook story with particular care, identified the Texarkana murders as one of the most plausible real-world antecedents for the legend's central scenario. The geographic overlap between the attacks and some of the earliest known southern regional variants of the Hook story is part of that case. The Hook legend surfaces earliest in oral traditions from the American South and Midwest, and the communities where it first took root were communities that had been shaped by that press coverage in the years before. The connection Brunvand identified is circumstantial in the sense that no direct link has been documented, no chain of transmission traced person by person from the Texarkana roads to the first telling of a story about a hook on a car door handle. Circumstantial does not mean weak. It means the evidence points in a direction without being able to close the final distance. What the Texarkana case provided, and what Brunvand and subsequent researchers have found significant, was a real event that already possessed the structural elements the legend would later carry. The isolated road, the parked car, the couple, the violence coming from outside, unexpected from someone without a traceable motive, in a setting that had been socially coded as dangerous even before the attacks made it dangerous in a documented, factual sense. When that scenario existed first in reality, and then in news coverage, and then in community memory, the distance between those three forms was already shorter than it might have been for an event set in a different kind of place. The Lover's Lane setting was already a subject of community attention in 1946, and what the Texarkana murders did, among other things, was provide a real occasion for fears that had been present before the occasion arrived. A library archive room, if visited on the right afternoon, contains a particular kind of quiet. The microfilm drawers are metal, labeled in typewriter font, organized by year and county. The reels themselves are small and plastic and slightly yellowed at the edges. Threading one onto the reader is a mechanical act. The spool catches, the film advances, the image on the screen resolves from blur into the specific text of a morning that has not been a morning for a very long time. A researcher working through 1946 Texas newspapers on such an afternoon would find the Texarkana coverage accumulating reel by reel, the early reports cautious and brief, the later ones longer and more detailed, as it became clear that what had happened was not finished. Between those early reports and the last ones, the shape of the story is already visible, the elements are already present that would travel forward, already simplified by the news format into something portable, something that could be carried in summary form by someone who had only read the first paragraph. Researchers who study how real events become legend have described a set of mechanisms that appears with consistency across many different cases. Real events in this account are simplified as they move from direct knowledge into communal memory. The details that are hardest to hold, the contingent and the specific, tend to drop away first, leaving the structural elements that are easiest to carry and easiest to pass along. Symbolic elements are amplified. The meaning of a thing grows more explicit as the texture of it fades. Motivations, which in real criminal cases are often banal or unclear or both, tend in legendary form to become opaque and irrational. The attacker without comprehensible reason, the threat without a face that could be understood. The setting moves from the specific this road, this town, this county, towards something that folklorists describe as archetypal, a version of the place that is general enough to feel applicable anywhere, any similar road, any similar night. Those mechanisms are not deliberate. They are not the product of a decision by any teller to simplify or generalize or amplify. They appear to be features of how memory and oral transmission work together across social boundaries, how a story adjusts itself to the expectations and local geography and specific anxieties of each new audience it meets. The Hook Legends scenario, by the time it appears in print in the late 1950s, is already quite general. The road is unnamed, the town is unnamed, the couple is unnamed, the attacker is defined only by the hook that replaced his hand, which is itself a kind of placeholder for violence rather than a description of it. That generality was not engineered. It accumulated, detail by detail dropped, and then forgotten over the years that separated the events that may have seeded it from the oral tradition that carried it forward. The community meetings that followed the Texarkana attacks in 1946 were held in church halls and schoolrooms, neighbors gathering in the particular atmosphere that follows a shared public shock, the voices lower than usual, the chairs arranged informally, the specific details of what had happened already beginning their early blurring at the edges. A community meeting is itself a transmission event. The accounts shared in that room are already slightly different from the accounts shared in the room the night before, adjusted in the telling by what the teller has had time to absorb and process, by what the teller's audience already knows, by what the teller wants the story to accomplish in the telling of it. Fear, when it moves through conversation, is already on its way to becoming something other than news. It is already on its way to becoming the kind of story that communities use to talk about the things they are afraid of. Gillian Bennett, whose work on belief and legend examined how communities process fear through narrative, and Eric Good, whose research on moral panics traced the conditions under which real events become amplified into community-wide anxiety, have each contributed to the understanding of why certain real crimes become legend seeds more readily than others. What their work taken together suggests is that the transformation is not random. It happens most readily when the real event occurs in a setting that is already socially charged, already a subject of community attention, already loaded with the particular anxieties of its moment. The Lover's Lane setting in 1950s America was exactly such a setting. Churches and schools and parent-teacher associations had been discussing it for years before the Hook legend arrived. The parked car at the edge of town had already been named a site of moral danger in community discourse long before the story provided a different kind of danger, with a hook instead of a sermon and an escaped killer instead of a concerned pastor. Into that charged setting, the Texarkana attacks had arrived a decade earlier with the weight of documented, publicized real events. The two things, the community anxiety and the real crimes, had existed in the same cultural space, and the Hook legend emerged from that space into oral circulation in communities that had been shaped by both. The folklorists who have traced this connection are careful about the word caused. What they are willing to say is that the Texarkana murders provided a plausible real-world antecedent, that the geographic and chronological proximity is significant, that the structural similarity between the attacks and the legend's central scenario is not coincidental in any straightforward sense. They are not willing to say that one caused the other in a simple traceable line, because the evidence does not support that, and because the mechanisms by which real events become legends are more gradual and more diffuse than a simple causal claim would suggest. On a December night in 1968, Lake Herman Road near Benicia, California, ran alongside open fields on one side and rose gently toward a slight hill on the other, the sky clear and very dark, the nearest house at a distance that would take several minutes to cover on foot. The road had no particular prior significance. It was not locally famous, not especially remote, not a location that any community had already been discussing. On that night, 16-year-old David Faraday and 17-year-old Betty Lou Jensen were parked on that road when they were attacked and killed. The attack was later identified as the first confirmed act attributed to the killer, who became known as the Zodiac, a case that, like the Texarkana murders more than 2 decades earlier, was never fully resolved and left behind a person never identified or convicted. The structural similarity between what happened on Lake Herman Road that December and the scenario at the center of the Hook legend was noticed almost immediately, and media coverage of the case in the days and weeks that followed made the connection explicit, discussing the attack in language that referenced the urban legend directly. That coverage was itself a transmission event, a large-scale, nationally distributed return of the Hook legend's scenario to public attention, this time not as a story circulating orally among teenagers, but as a reference point in newspaper coverage of a real and recent crime. The two things were already in conversation by the time the first week of coverage had passed. The legend had existed for a decade or more in oral tradition, and the real attack was now being read through the legend's frame, even as the legend's frame was being reinforced and amplified by the real attack. Researchers who have written about the Zodiac case and its relationship to the Hook legend are cautious about the direction of influence. The legend clearly predated the Lake Herman Road attack, and the similarities between the scenario the legend describes and the scenario of the attack are real, not constructed by coverage. Whether the legend influenced the coverage, or the coverage refreshed and reinforced the legend, or both things happen simultaneously in a system that does not break cleanly into cause and effect. These are questions for which the evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, and the researchers who have addressed them have generally been content to name the suggestiveness without forcing it into a cleaner shape than the material supports. What is clear is that by 1968, the Hook legend was established enough in American culture that it could function as a reference point in mass media coverage of a real event, that journalists could invoke it without explanation, assuming their readers would recognize it, that readers did in fact recognize it, and that the recognition moved in both directions, the legend coloring the event and the event refreshing the legend. That relationship between real events and the oral traditions that process them is not unique to the Hook story. It appears wherever legends and documented events share enough structural overlap to speak to each other, and the Hook legend scenario is generic enough that such overlaps are not especially rare. A parked car on a dark road, an outside threat arriving unexpectedly, evidence left behind. These are elements that appear in real criminal cases with some regularity, and each time they appear, they enter into a conversation with the legend's version of the same scenario. A small Texas town in the 1950s, in the years between the Texarkana coverage and the Hook legend's first appearance in print, would have contained all of the elements that the folklorist's account of legend formation identifies as necessary. Community anxiety about unsupervised teenagers, locally known roads that served as lovers' lanes, their names familiar to every student in the district and to no one outside it. The memory, carried forward from 1946, of what had happened on similar roads in a nearby state. The oral tradition already present in slumber party conversations and campfire stories, carrying the same structural scenario in versions not yet fixed, not yet settled into the form that would eventually appear in print. In such a town, on such a road, the Hook story was not waiting to arrive from somewhere else. It was assembling itself from materials already present, in conversations already happening, between people who were already doing what communities have always done with the things they fear, telling each other about them in the dark, in voices slightly lower than usual, with an ending that everyone already half expects. The folklorist arriving in such a community in the early 1970s, sitting across a kitchen table from a middle-aged woman who was remembering with precise and slightly surprised clarity the first time she had heard the story, would have found the memory organized around its emotional specificity rather than its factual content. The woman remembered not the exact version of the story she had heard at a slumber party when she was 14, but the feeling of it, the moment the teller's voice dropped, the particular quality of the silence that followed, the collective laughter that broke it, the way the room felt afterward, warmer and closer than it had felt before. The story itself had already done most of its changing in the years between that slumber party and the kitchen table conversation, and the folklorist's notebook would have recorded not the original story, but the trace of it that memory had preserved. That notebook, pages of handwritten summaries from interviews conducted across the South and Midwest in the 1970s, each account slightly different from the last, the variations accumulating across the pages into a kind of map is the kind of document that makes the mechanics of legend transmission visible in a particular way. Each variation is a record of a transmission event, the point where the story crossed from one teller to another and adjusted itself in the crossing. The hook moved from one hand to another. The road changed counties, changed states, changed from gravel to asphalt. The couple drove away in one version and stayed in another. The hook was found on the door handle in some accounts and found on the ground beneath the door in others. And in a few early Texas variants, it was not a hook at all, but a mark, a scratch, a claw-shaped trace left on the metal and discovered in the morning light. Those variations, taken together, are not evidence that the story is confused or corrupted, or that the tellers were unreliable. They are evidence of how oral traditions work, how each transmission is also a small transformation, how the story is always in the process of finding the shape that best fits the moment and the audience and the specific geography of the community telling it. The core remains stable: the couple, the parked car, the dark road, the threat that almost arrived, the physical evidence left behind. Around that stable core, the details shift, adjust, settle into slightly different arrangements, and the arrangement that survives in any given community is the one that felt most true to that community's particular version of the anxiety the story was carrying. Psychologists and folklorists who have studied the transformation of real crimes into legend have described this process in several different ways, but there is a point of agreement across most of their accounts. The setting matters more than the event. A crime that occurs in a socially charged setting, a setting that communities have already been discussing, already been worrying about, already been framing in moral and communal terms, is far more likely to seed a legend than a structurally similar crime in a neutral setting. The Lover's Lane was not a neutral setting in 1950s America. It was a site already loaded with community attention, already named and discussed and warned against, already present in the discourse of churches and schools and parent-teacher associations as a location of specific moral concern. When real violence arrived in that setting, it arrived in a place that communities had already been imagining violence arriving, and the connection between the imagined and the real was therefore very short. What Good's research on moral panics and Bennett's work on belief and legend establish, taken together, is that communities do not transform real events into legends because they are irrational or because they lack better ways of processing fear. They do it because the legend form serves specific functions. It carries fear across social boundaries. It preserves the emotional content of an event long after the factual content has faded. It provides a narrative structure within which fear can be experienced communally and then released. The Hook story, in this account, is not a misremembering of the Texarkana murders or the Lake Herman Road attack. It is something the communities that told it assembled from real elements and real anxieties and real events into a form that could carry those elements farther and longer than any single account of any single event could carry them alone. The pale gravel of a road outside a Texas high school in the late 1950s would have looked much like the pale gravel of the road outside Texarkana in 1946. The trees close on both sides, the sky visible in patches through the branches, the particular quiet of a road with no traffic at that hour. The teenagers who parked on that road on weekend nights knew its local name and knew it was the kind of place their parents and teachers and pastors had been warning them about. and the warning was itself part of the appeal, the way the warnings of that era seemed to promise that something worth warning against was possible in those dark and specific places. The Hook story, circulating among those teenagers in versions not yet printed, not yet nationally distributed, not yet formally classified by any folklorist, was doing its own work in its own time from Stephen Wertz, and the work was not primarily about the hook or the killer or the escaped prisoner with the prosthetic hand. The work was about the road and the car and the couple and the question of what could arrive from the dark outside the windows and what could be found on the door handle in the morning. The story gave those fears a shape precise enough to be told and shared and collectively laughed off, and in giving them that shape, it also gave the communities that told it a way of carrying those fears across time, from one telling to the next, from one generation to the next, from a slumber party in 1957 to a kitchen table conversation in 1973. The folklorist threading a 1946 microfilm reel onto a reader in a library archive room in the late afternoon, watching the headlines scroll past in the darkened quiet, was engaged in a different kind of transmission than the slumber party teller or the campfire counselor, but the act had something in common with those others. Looking at old headlines is a way of asking what a community knew at a particular moment, what it was afraid of, how it had organized its fear into language. The headlines from that spring in Texarkana organized the fear of a specific, real, ongoing threat into the careful language of journalism, and that language traveled through the wire services to other communities, and somewhere in that travel, in the simplification, in the generalization, in the months and years of community conversation that followed, the specific became archetypal, and the archetypal became available to story. The Lake Herman Road attack in 1968 added a later layer to that already complex history. By that point, the Hook legend had been circulating for more than a decade, had appeared in print in the Dear Abby column, had been told at slumber parties and campfires across the country, had already accumulated the variations that a decade of oral transmission produces. When the Zodiac's first attack was described in media coverage that explicitly referenced the legend, the reference was not just an editorial observation about structural similarity. It was the latest moment in a long conversation between real events and the stories communities tell about them, a conversation that had been going on since at least 1946, and that the 1968 coverage joined without resolving and without ending. A car door handle, seen in the early morning light on a cold December road, is a specific and ordinary object, chrome bright in the places that get touched most often, slightly duller at the edges, attached to a door that opens and closes with the particular solidity of a well-made thing. If there is a scratch on it, a small curved mark along the lower edge where the metal is thinner, the mark could have been made in any of a dozen ordinary ways. It could have been made by a belt buckle, or a key, or a piece of gravel thrown up by a passing car. It could have been made by a tree branch in a wind. It could have been made long before the car arrived on that road, and no one who drove it noticed, because no one thought to look. The Hook story, in its early Texas variants, sometimes ended not with a hook found on the door handle, but with claw marks, scratches on the metal, curved and shallow, evidence of something that had been there and was now gone. In those versions, the story ended on the mark rather than the object, on the trace rather than the thing itself, and the trace was ambiguous, in the way that traces are ambiguous. It could be explained, but explaining it would require accepting that someone had tried the door in the dark and had not quite managed to open it before the couple drove away. The claw marks were gentler than a hook in the specific way that ambiguity is gentler than certainty. They left the question slightly open. They invited the listener to settle on their own explanation, or not to settle at all. What those early variants suggest, taken alongside the hook variants and the versions with no physical evidence at all, is that the hook legend in its earliest period was still in the process of finding its final form, still being decided by the tellers who carried it, still adjusting toward the version that would eventually become the one most people know. The hook, prosthetic, specific, belonging to an escaped criminal identified by his missing hand, is a more confident conclusion than a scratch on a door. It requires a prior establishment of the escaped prisoner who has a hook for a hand, and in the versions where that establishment has been made, the hook on the door handle is a satisfying close because it confirms what the radio announcement had made possible. In the versions where the story has not yet acquired the radio announcement, or where the radio announcement has a different content, or where the teller has adjusted the setup to fit a different local geography, the hook may not yet be available as an ending, and the scratch mark does what it can in its place. A legend finding its final form is not a single event. It is a long, slow settling. Many tellers, many tellings, many audiences who receive one version and pass on a slightly adjusted one, and the settling can take years, decades, and even then the form is never completely fixed. The hook story is still told in variants. The radio announcement changes, the location changes, the couple's decision to drive away is sometimes made quickly and sometimes made after debate. The hook is sometimes found on the door handle and sometimes on the ground, still attached to a length of chain. In some versions, the couple hears the scratching and drives away without knowing what caused it, and the hook is found later by someone else in the morning when the road looks ordinary again. Those variations are not mistakes in the tradition. They are the tradition, the ongoing life of a story that has not finished adapting to the people who tell it. The pale gravel road, the close trees, the particular quiet. A spring morning in 1946 when the papers had not yet arrived. A summer night in the late 1950s when the story was being told for what might have been the first time or might have been the 100th. A December night in 1968 when the road ran alongside open fields in a California valley and the sky was very dark and very clear. The same structural scenario in different places and different years, carrying the same essential question: what is outside the windows? What will be found on the door in the morning? What leaves a mark that cannot quite be explained across the decades and the distances between those nights? In the handwriting of a folklorist's notebook, in the pages of a microfilm reader, in the memory of a middle-aged woman at a kitchen table who could still feel, without quite being able to describe it, the quality of the silence that fell over the room at a slumber party when she was 14 and the story reached its ending. A legend is sometimes the shape that real fear takes when it needs to travel farther than memory alone can carry it. The hook mark on the car door, in those early Texas variants that ended without a hook and without a certainty, only a curved scratch on the metal and the morning light coming in at a low angle across the road, was itself a kind of open question, not yet resolved into the form the story would eventually settle on, still in the hands of the tellers who were deciding, one telling at a time, what the evidence at the end of the story would finally be, and what it would mean, and how far and how long it could carry everything they needed it to carry. A circle of girls in a darkened living room in 1967, arranged on sleeping bags with their knees pulled close, their faces turned toward the one sitting slightly upright near the center of the room. Her voice has already dropped. The others have gone still in the way people go still when a story reaches the place where the story starts to matter. Outside, the neighborhood is quiet, the street lamps casting their usual orange light on the usual pavement. Inside, the only thing moving is her voice, falling lower with each sentence, and the particular quality of attention that 10 girls in a dark room can produce when none of them wants to be the first to look away from the door. That is where the Hook story lived for most of its life. Not in newspapers, not in books, not on screens of any kind. It lived in moments exactly like that one, a living room after midnight, a summer campfire burning low, a back seat on the way home from school, with two friends leaning in from either side, and it moved from person to person, the way all oral stories move, through the breath and the timing and the particular pause a teller knows to place just before the ending arrives. Folklorist Richard Dorson spent much of his career documenting how oral legends like this one actually traveled through communities, and what he found was not a single clean line from one teller to the next. The pattern was something more like overlapping waves, each one moving through a different social network, each one carrying a version of the story that had been quietly adjusted along the way. A detail that worked for a town in Missouri might be changed for a town in Ohio, because in Ohio the local geography was different, and the story needed a road that listeners could recognize rather than one they would have to imagine. A teller in one community might give the escaped killer a specific institutional origin, a psychiatric hospital, a prison farm, because that framing fit what her audience already believed about where dangerous people came from. Another teller might leave the origin entirely unnamed because the namelessness of a threat was, in her experience, more unsettling than any specific address. Neither version was wrong, both were the story. The story was, in some sense, every version it had ever been, moving through communities the way a pattern of water moves, not the same water twice, but the same recognizable shape. What Dorson observed across his fieldwork was that oral legends mutated most reliably at social boundaries, the places where a story crossed from one kind of community into another, from one generation into the next, from one region into a different one, with different roads and different names and different things to be afraid of. Each crossing was an opportunity for adjustment. The teller standing at that boundary was not lying when she changed a detail. She was translating. She was doing what storytellers have always done, which is to make the story true for the room she was standing in, and the truth of a legend has never been purely a matter of whether its specific facts are accurate. The truth of a legend is whether it lands, whether it finds the thing in the listener that is already waiting to receive it. The Hook story was very good at landing. It had, from its earliest documented circulation, a structural elegance that made it easy to carry. There was a couple, and a car, and a radio announcement, and a sound at the window, and a decision to leave, and then the discovery at the end that whatever made the sound had been there, at the handle of the door, close enough to touch the car before they drove away. The shape of that structure, the near miss, the evidence found after the danger has passed, the way the horror arrives not during the event, but in the calm afterwards, was a shape that fit easily inside a short conversation, a few minutes of someone's voice in the dark, with no props and no preparation needed. The teller needed only the story itself, and the story, by the time it reached any given teller, had already been polished by hundreds of previous tellings into something that moved through a room without catching on anything. Elizabeth Tucker, whose work on teenage folklore remains one of the most closely observed accounts of how young people use and transmit stories, documented specifically that teenage girls at slumber parties were among the most active transmitters of the Hook legend throughout the 1960s and 70s. This was not a simple observation about who liked scary stories. Tucker's research described a social function. The slumber party was a space in which the usual rules of daytime life were partially suspended, in which girls who spent their days navigating school hierarchies and parental oversight were briefly in a room with only each other and the dark, and the stories that circulated in those spaces were not separate from that context. They were part of it. The Hook story, with its specific geography of parked cars and late nights, and the moment when a couple is furthest from supervision, spoke directly to concerns that were, for the girls telling it, entirely present tense. It was not history, it was a map of a world they were already moving through. The teller, who sat slightly upright on her sleeping bag and dropped her voice at exactly the right moment, was doing something that served the group in ways that went beyond entertainment, though entertainment was part of it. She was putting into story form a set of anxieties that had no other easy form, about what happened when supervision ended, about what lived in the dark beyond the reach of ordinary life, about the particular vulnerability of being two people alone in a car on a road no one else knew, to look down. The story was a container for all of that, and passing it around the circle was a way of passing the container around, of saying without saying it plainly, here is what the world outside this room sometimes looks like. Here is a shape for the thing none of us can quite name. After the story ended and the nervous laughter came, the container had been held and set down, and the room was the same room it had been before, with the same girls on the same sleeping bags, and that was part of the function too. The campfire transmission context carried its own particular texture. Summer camp for many American children in the 1960s and 70s was one of the first extended experiences of nighttime that was genuinely unmediated by home and family, and the darkness beyond a campfire ring was a different kind of darkness than the darkness of a suburban bedroom with the familiar sounds of a house around it. Counselors and older campers used that context deliberately, in the sense that anyone who has ever told a scary story outdoors knows to use the environment. The sound a branch makes when it moves in the tree line becomes part of the story without ever being mentioned, because the listeners supply that detail themselves. The Hook story traveled easily into this setting because its essential scenario, isolation, darkness, something approaching from outside the reach of light, was a scenario the campfire itself was already providing. The story and the setting confirmed each other, and what was confirmed settled more deeply into memory than a story heard under fluorescent lights ever could. By the time the Hook story had been circulating for 2 decades in these oral environments, it had accumulated a kind of distributed editorial history that no single author had managed and no single publication had shaped. The version a girl heard at a slumber party in 1972 in suburban Kansas City had been, without her knowledge, shaped by tellings in Texas and Ohio and Missouri and 100 living rooms and campfire rings that she would never visit and whose particular adjustments she would never be able to trace. She received a story that had been worn smooth by use, its unnecessary edges removed by the accumulated judgment of every teller who had noticed which details made a room go quiet and which ones made it drift. When she passed it on, she added her own small adjustments, a road she actually knew, a radio station that actually existed, a detail about the couple that made them feel slightly more real, and the version she produced moved on with those additions into rooms she would never enter. Pauline Phillips, writing as Abigail Van Buren, encountered a version of this story in 1960 and published it in her nationally syndicated column, and the effect of that publication on the story's circulation was not what might be expected. It did not replace the oral version or standardize it into a single canonical form. What it did was something more interesting and harder to trace, which is that it confirmed the story's legitimacy for a generation of readers who had already heard variants of it through word of mouth. A reader in Arkansas who had first encountered the Hook story at a church youth group 2 years earlier would have recognized it in the Dear Abby column that November morning and felt in the way one feels when something private turns out to be broadly known, a small confirming click. The story she had always been told was real enough to appear in print. Not real in the sense of factually verified, but real in the sense of recognized, worth repeating, serious enough for a national audience. That confirmation traveled back into the oral tradition and gave it a new kind of weight. Linda Degg spent much of her scholarly career thinking carefully about exactly this relationship between oral legend transmission and mass media, and her conclusion, set out at length in her 1994 book, was that the arrival of mass media in American life had not ended oral legend circulation or replaced it. The two systems had become superimposed, running simultaneously along different channels and reinforcing each other at every point of contact. A story that appeared in a newspaper was picked up by people who then told it to people, who then told it to people who then years later encountered it in a magazine or on a radio program and felt that click of recognition. The mass media appearance gave the story a kind of credibility that oral transmission could not fully provide on its own. The oral circulation gave the story an intimacy and an adaptability that mass media could not replicate. Between the two systems, the story moved faster and more durably than either channel could have managed alone. The early 1960s, during which the Hook story was spreading outward from its regional origins in the South and Midwest, were also the years in which American television was becoming a ubiquitous household presence, and the relationship between television content and oral folklore was already beginning to produce the hybrid transmission patterns that Dick would later document. A segment on a television news program about teenage safety and lovers' lanes would not present the Hook story as a legend. It might not mention the Hook story at all, but it would present the same geography, the same anxieties, the same figures of parked teenagers and dark roads and the dangers that attended unsupervised youth. A viewer who had already heard the Hook story at a school lunch table would find the television segment fitting around that story like a frame, lending it the authority of the broadcast without ever naming it, and the story would carry that authority forward into its next telling. There is a particular quality to the transmission of a story that gains credibility from multiple simultaneous channels, a quality that is different from the credibility of either channel alone. When a thing is told to one in a friend's living room, and then encountered again in a newspaper column, and then discussed in a school hallway, and then referenced obliquely in a television program, it begins to feel less like something someone made up, and more like something the world keeps returning to, something that has a reason to persist. The Hook story generated that quality not because any single source established its factual truth, but because so many overlapping sources kept producing versions of its scenario: the dark road, the isolated couple, the threat from outside, that the scenario itself began to feel like simply the way things were at the edge of town after dark. Slumber parties and campfires carried the story through the 1960s and into the 70s, and by the 80s the story was old enough that some of its tellers were now adults who remembered hearing it in childhood and who were passing it on, with the particular authority of a remembered experience. The Usenet newsgroup Alt, Folklore, Urban, which became active in the mid 1980s and remained a significant hub of online discussion into the early 2000s, contains archived threads from the early 1990s in which participants discussed the Hook story, not as a current scare, but as a classic, something they had encountered as children and were now examining from a small historical distance. Some of these participants had read Bronvan's 1981 book and brought its analytical vocabulary into the conversation. Others were sharing memories of specific first encounters with the legend: a campfire in 1969, a babysitter in 1972, an older cousin at Thanksgiving who told it to the younger children while the adults were in another room. What those archived threads reveal is the story being examined from two directions at once: backward toward its remembered origins and childhood experience, and sideways toward its structural features and its place in the wider category of urban legend. Participants who had once been frightened by the Hook story were now interested in it, and the shift from frightened to interested did not diminish the story's hold on them. If anything, it deepened it, because what had once been a single emotional experience, the fear, the nervous laughter, the lingering unease on the walk home, was now also an intellectual one, a question about where stories come from and how they manage to feel true when they are not verifiably so. A user typing out a version of the Hook story into one of those early Usenet threads, watching green text appear, letter by letter on a black screen in a quiet university computer lab in 1991, was participating in something that felt quite different from a slumber party circle, and shared more with it than was immediately obvious. The basic act was the same: a teller producing a version of the story for an audience, making choices, conscious or not, about which details to include and which to leave out, framing the narrative in a way that suited the medium and the audience available. The medium was different. The audience was invisible and distributed across servers rather than gathered on sleeping bags. But the story arrived at the reader with the same need for a response, the same offer of a near miss and a piece of evidence and a moment of retrospective recognition, and the reader's response, reading alone at a terminal in a quiet room, was its own version of the nervous laughter and the collective lean-in. The Internet's earliest folklore communities were, in this sense, extensions of the oral tradition rather than replacements for it, which is precisely the point that Dedja had been making about mass media more broadly. The Usenet archives preserve, in their particular format of threaded text posts and quoted responses, something very close to the conversational texture of the oral tradition, people responding to each other's versions, correcting details, adding variants they had heard in different contexts, disputing the FOAF attribution structure while simultaneously reproducing it. Someone would post a version of the Hook story and note that they had heard it from a friend who heard it from a cousin, and several replies would arrive pointing out that this attribution pattern, the friend of a friend, the cousin of a classmate, the neighbor of someone who knew someone, was not a feature of this particular story, but of the entire category it belonged to. The analysis was there, visible in the thread, and the story went on being told anyway, because analysis does not dissolve the thing being analyzed. The move from Usenet forums to the broader internet carried the Hook story through a series of changes that were, in their way, as significant as any it had undergone in oral transmission. The platform shifted from text-heavy discussion boards to increasingly visual and immediately shareable formats, and the story adapted to each shift. Email chains in the 1990s carried versions of the Hook story tagged as warnings, real accounts, supposedly verified, the hook discovered on a specific door in a specific town, in a format that reproduced the FOAF attribution structure digitally and distributed it to contact lists rather than slumber party circles. The scale was different and the speed was different, but the structural grammar of the transmission was the same. Someone told someone who told someone, the story claiming at each link to originate one step closer to a real event. Web forums and message boards in the early 2000s created communities organized specifically around horror folklore and urban legend. Spaces where users could accumulate and share and debate and elaborate on stories in ways that had previously required either physical proximity or the slow correspondence of academic journals. The Hook story occupied a foundational position in these communities, old enough to be canonical, familiar enough to be referenced without being fully retold, and structurally simple enough to serve as a template against which newer, more elaborate digital horror stories could be measured. When the creepypasta format emerged from forums including 4chan's paranormal board and gradually consolidated into dedicated archives like the Creepypasta Wiki, which was established in 2010, it inherited from its predecessor communities a set of conventions that were recognizably descended from oral legend conventions, and the Hook story's influence on those conventions was a matter that participants discussed openly. The Creepypasta Wiki represents one of the more interesting documentary records of a community actively managing a living tradition, because unlike a slumber party or a campfire, it preserves its editorial history in ways that allow the process of a legend's development to be observed in something approaching real time. Stories posted there were voted on, commented on, revised in response to feedback, and sometimes reclassified or removed. The community developed a shared aesthetic vocabulary for what a horror legend should feel like and how it should be structured, and that vocabulary bore the marks of the oral tradition it had descended from. The first-person account, the FOAF attribution, the rational protagonist gradually confronted with something that resists rational explanation, the piece of physical evidence that persists after the main event and demands to be interpreted. A teenager reading a Hook legend adaptation on the Creepypasta Wiki late at night in 2012, the room dark except for the screen's blue-white glow, was reading something that had traveled from a living room floor in 1967 through more transmission channels and more editorial hands than could be fully counted, and had arrived at that screen with its essential structure intact: the isolated couple, the dark road, the evidence found afterwards, the invitation to feel, for a moment, the specific unease of a world that contains more than what is visible. What changed in each of those transmission environments was not the story's structure, but its dress. In oral versions, the dress was the voice of a specific teller and the specific road she named. In print, it was the column format and the particular authority of a nationally syndicated newspaper. In Usenet threads, it was the conversational texture of people comparing variants and half-remembering dates. In creepypasta archives, it was the formatting conventions of the genre and the community's rating system, and the claim, sitting quietly in the first line of the post, that this account was true. The dress changed at each crossing. The story wore each new dress comfortably because the shape underneath it had been refined by decades of telling into something that fit most containers without requiring significant adjustment. The folklorist's term for this kind of structural durability is ostension, though the concept it names is simpler than the term suggests. A story that persists across changing media and changing communities is not persisting by accident. It is persisting because something in its structure continues to find a response in the people it reaches, because the shape of the near miss, the shape of the evidence found afterwards, the shape of a threat that approaches while attention is elsewhere, continues to land in rooms and on screens and in individual imaginations with enough consistency to motivate another telling. The Hook story has been that kind of story for more than 60 years. The rooms it has traveled through span a range that no single teller in 1953 could have anticipated. From the southern oral communities, where its earliest documented variants circulated, through the syndication presses of 1960, through every slumber party and campfire and Usenet thread and digital archive along the way, a teenager in 2012 reading the story on a glowing screen in a dark room encountered it in a format that was completely different from anything available when the story was new, and the story was, at its core, the same story, the same dark road, the same couple, the same turning of the car away from something that left its mark on the door handle. The platform had changed, the version had changed, but the story's central offer, which was the offer of a safe encounter with a specific kind of unease, had not changed, and the response it produced in that dark room, the slight shift of posture, the eyes moving a little faster across the lines, the awareness of the room's own darkness pressing in from the edges of the screen's light, was not very different from the response it produced in a circle of girls on sleeping bags in 1967, when one of them sat slightly upright and let her voice drop, and the others went still and leaned in close. A story that can cross that many kinds of distance without losing what it is doing is not a simple thing, whatever it looks like from the outside. From the outside, the Hook story has always looked like something a little rough-edged, a little improbable, a legend too familiar and too simple to bear much weight. From the inside of its transmission, in the specific moment when a teller's voice drops and a room goes quiet, and the evidence of the near miss is being laid out in the particular darkness available, it is doing something that no single version of it, in any medium, has ever quite managed to make unnecessary. It keeps finding rooms that need it. It keeps finding the moment when a voice drops and the others lean in, and in that moment, whatever format it arrives in, it is still the same story, finding the same response in the same animal that first needed a near miss and a piece of evidence and the specific relief of having been, for a moment, close to something and then safely away. The transmission chain that connects a slumber party in 1967 to a glowing screen in 2012 is not a straight line. It is a web or a system of overlapping waves, as Dorson might have said, each wave carrying the story through a different social landscape and depositing a slightly different version at the far edge of its reach. From those deposited versions, new waves began, and those waves crossed over into digital channels that were not yet imagined when the first oral versions were being refined in the communities of the American South and Midwest. The story traveled all of that distance and is still, in some form, traveling in creepypasta archives and YouTube comment threads and whatever transmission environment the next decade produces for people who want to be briefly close to something and then safely away in a dark room in good company at the end of a long ordinary day. A teenager in a dark room late at night in 2012, reading the story on a screen that is the only light in the room, is in some ways very far from the girls on the sleeping bags in 1967, and in some ways the same distance from the same story, which has been crossing distances for more than 60 years and has not yet reached its end. The screen goes dark eventually. The room fills with the ordinary quiet of a house at rest. The story has passed through and moved on, already finding the next room, the next voice, the next circle of people, leaning in toward the part where the voice drops and the near miss becomes visible, and the same door handle, in the same first light of morning, sits waiting on a car that no one has quite been able to explain. At a slumber party, in the specific kind of darkness that only exists inside a living room with the lights deliberately off, there is a moment that comes just after a story ends. Not the story itself, not the telling. The moment after, when the last word has settled and no one has moved yet, and the room is so quiet that the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen becomes, briefly, the loudest thing in the world. That moment has a particular quality. It is about 4 seconds long. The girls on their sleeping bags have gone absolutely still, their knees drawn up, their breathing shallow, the story still moving through them the way water moves through a sponge, not sitting on the surface, but held inside it, present in every part at once. And then one of them laughs, a short and involuntary sound, the kind of laugh that the body produces when it needs to let something out, and that laugh opens a door and all the others follow through it, and the room fills with noise and warmth and the particular relief of having been frightened in a safe place and finding on the other side of it that everyone is still there. That moment, the 4 seconds of silence, and then the flood of laughter and the girls leaning toward each other on the floor, is not incidental to the Hook story. It is not a side effect of the story. In a real and measurable sense, that moment is what the story was for. Finnish cognitive neuroscientist Antti Revonsuo formally articulated, in a paper published in the year 2000, a proposal about the function of simulated threat in the human mind. His argument was that the mind has a dedicated system for rehearsing threatening events inside a safe context, running the scenario of danger, experiencing something close to the physiological responses that real danger would produce, and then returning intact to the room, to the sleeping bag, to the circle of friends. The hypothesis is called threat simulation theory, and its central claim is that this system exists not as a flaw or a quirk, but as an adaptation, a mechanism by which the mind prepares itself for threats it has not yet encountered by practicing them in spaces where they cannot actually harm it. A story around a campfire, in that framework, is not entertainment in the decorative sense. It is a kind of training. The mind processes the Hook story, the dark road, the car, the sound at the window, the thing found in the morning, and something in it runs the scenario forward, asks the questions an animal asks when it has registered a threat, tests its own readiness, and then releases the tension when the story ends and the fire is still burning, and everyone is still sitting in their own unharmed bodies at the edge of the dark. The Hook story, told to a circle of teenagers in the 1960s, or the 1970s, or the 1990s, or last summer at a camp in the hills above a lake, whose name only the local children know, has been doing this same work for the entire time it has existed. Each telling is a rehearsal. Each moment of held breath is the system running its test. Each eruption of laughter at the end is the system confirming, still safe, still here. The threat was practiced and survived. Experimental psychologist Matthias Clausen, writing in his 2017 book on why humans seek out horror, made a specific argument about the Hook story's particular shape. What the story presents, a predator in human form, moving in darkness, targeting 2 people who are isolated and unaware, is not random. It maps precisely onto a category of threat that would have been genuinely dangerous throughout the vast majority of human history. A predator-like human aggressor approaching from outside the group's awareness, in conditions of low light, in a place far from other people who might help. The scenario is not arbitrary. It is the scenario that the threat simulation system was, in a sense, designed to practice. This is why the Hook story has never required elaborate plotting to be effective. There is no backstory that matters. The couple at the center of it need no names, no personalities, no arc of character development. What they need is to be alone and to be in a car and for it to be dark and for something to be outside. Those four elements are enough to engage the system completely. Everything else, the radio announcement, the drive home, the morning discovery, is the architecture that delivers those four elements in the sequence most likely to activate the response. The story is, in this sense, a very efficient machine. Generations of tellers refined it toward maximum effect without knowing they were doing so, passing it forward with the variations that made it work better, and dropping the variations that made it work less well. That process of refinement, operating across decades and across hundreds of thousands of tellings, produced something close to a perfect specimen of its type. Developmental psychologists studying how people engage with fear across the course of a life have documented a consistent and striking pattern. Teenagers demonstrate higher levels of engagement with fear narratives than any other age group by a measurable margin. Researcher Margie Kerr, who has spent years studying what draws people to frightening experiences, has identified two interlocking reasons for this. The first is biological. The adolescent dopaminergic system is in a period of active development, producing elevated sensation seeking as a baseline characteristic of teenage experience. The nervous system is, in some meaningful sense, more open during these years, more responsive to strong stimuli, more interested in the edges of experience. The second reason is less biological and more situational. Teenagers are genuinely navigating a category of social and personal uncertainty that is real and not trivial. Questions about independence, about risk, about who is safe and who is not, about how to be alone in a world that has not yet resolved itself into reliable shapes. Fear narratives offer a space in which those real and unresolved anxieties can be rehearsed in a controlled way, held at a manageable remove, practiced without consequence. A girl at a slumber party in 1967 who is frightened by the Hook story is not only responding to the story, she is responding to the story through the particular lens of everything she is already carrying. The question of what the world outside her parents' house is actually like, the question of what it means to be alone with someone, the question of how much danger is real and how much is imagined, the question of what judgment looks like and who gets to exercise it. The story touches all of those questions from the outside as a safe proxy and lets her feel the edge of them without having to step over. This is part of why the Hook story was told most often and most persistently by and to teenage girls. It arrived precisely at the moment when the questions it addressed were most alive. Social psychologist Arthur Aaron spent years studying what produces interpersonal attraction and closeness between people, and one of the things his research established was that shared experience of physiological arousal, the elevated heart rate, the quickened breathing, the heightened awareness that comes with genuine or simulated threat, tends to increase the sense of connection between the people who experience it together. Later, researchers extended this finding specifically to shared fear experiences, and what they found was consistent with the original observation. People who are frightened together in a context that allows them to return to safety together report measurably stronger feelings of closeness and mutual trust in the aftermath. The slumber party where the Hook story was told was not only a place where a scary story happened, it was a place where a group of girls became briefly a unit. their nervous systems aligned, their attention focused on the same point, their bodies all responding to the same imagined threat at the same moment. The story gathered them. It pulled them out of their separate private selves and placed them for the duration of the telling inside a shared experience with distinct physical dimensions. And then the laughter came, and the relief, and the leaning toward each other, and in the moments after the story, they were measurably closer than they had been before it began. The Hook story was doing social work. It has always been doing social work. Neuroscientists studying fear responses have made a specific observation about the structure of the fear experience that adds one more layer to this picture. Using imaging technology that can track activity in specific brain regions over time, researchers have found that the recovery phase following peak fear arousal, the seconds and minutes immediately after the threatening stimulus has passed, produces a distinct pattern. The amygdala, which is the region most directly associated with fear processing, shows a rapid decline in activity during recovery. The prefrontal cortex, which has been quietly maintaining the awareness that the threat is not real throughout the experience, comes back into fuller prominence. And in that transition, from the peak of arousal to the return of calm, there is a window of experience that research subjects report as among the most pleasurable components of the entire fear event. Not the scare itself, the aftermath of the scare, the moment of confirmed safety. In a dark room on a Friday night in 1971, a girl sitting on a sleeping bag hears the final word of the Hook story and draws a sharp breath and does not move for 4 seconds. And then she laughs, and that laughter is not only relief, it is, in a physiological sense, a reward. Her nervous system is releasing the tension it accumulated during the story, and that release, coming all at once, is experienced as something genuinely pleasant, warm, full, slightly giddy. The story gave her something to release. The release was the point. Every teller of the Hook story who has ever paused at exactly the right moment, dropped their voice at the turn, and then watched the faces of their audience go still for a second before the laughter came. Every one of them discovered, through pure social feedback, that this sequence worked, that the pause was worth it, that the silence before the laughter was where the real thing happened. They passed that knowledge forward without knowing it was knowledge, adjusting their telling by instinct toward the shape that produced the best aftermath. And in doing so, they were participating in the same refinement process that had been running since the story's earliest versions were told around a kitchen table, or at the back of a classroom, or on a dark road outside a town in the American South. The story is a delivery mechanism for a specific experience, and the experience is what the story has always been for. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that means for the Hook story specifically. The central scenario is not pleasant. Couple alone, a threat outside the car, a discovery in the morning that implies how close the threat came. Taken at face value, this is not a story about anything comfortable, but the discomfort is the material from which the comfort is eventually made. The nervous system spends the duration of the story in a mild state of alert, processing the scenario, running the simulation, doing the work it was built to do. And then the story ends, and the room is still there, and the friends are still there. And the nervous system returns from its rehearsal to find that everything is exactly as it was. And that return is experienced as a specific and genuine pleasure that would not have been available without the tension that preceded it. The Hook story does not ask to be believed. That is part of how it works. The teller knows it is a story. The listeners know it is a story. The careful attribution, a friend of a friend, someone's cousin, a girl from another school in another town, is not meant to deceive. It is meant to create just enough plausibility to keep the simulation running, to prevent the prefrontal cortex from shutting the whole thing down too early. The story needs just enough purchase on the possible to let the threat simulation system do its work. Too obviously false, and the system disengages. Too realistically detailed, and the experience stops being pleasurable and starts being distressing. The hook story, refined over decades to occupy the exact middle space, is a story that is easy to almost believe while remaining completely safe to hear. This is not an accident. It is the result of selection. The versions that pushed too far toward the real became genuinely disturbing and were not passed forward in slumber party settings, because girls who were genuinely frightened, rather than pleasantly frightened, did not feel warm and connected afterward. They felt unsafe. And the feedback that produced was not positive, and the story in that form did not travel. The versions that were too obvious, too crude, too implausible even for a Friday night suspension of disbelief, did not produce the response, and those versions also did not travel as effectively. What traveled, with remarkable consistency across 60 years, is the version that sits in the middle, detailed enough to feel possible, contained enough to feel safe, shaped precisely toward the aftermath that is its own reward. That shape is the accumulated wisdom of everyone who has ever told the story and felt whether it worked. Margie Kerr's work on fear as experience, on what draws people to haunted houses, to horror films, to stories told in the dark, returns repeatedly to one finding that is easy to underestimate. The most important variable in determining whether a frightening experience is pleasurable or not is not the content of the fear. It is the context, the same stimulus, in a context where the person feels safe and in control, produces a pleasurable outcome. In a context where the person does not feel safe or in control, it produces something else entirely. The Slumber Party is a masterpiece of fearful experience design in this sense. It is one of the safest contexts imaginable. The girls are in a known house, in a known neighborhood, surrounded by their friends, with a responsible adult somewhere in the building. They are as insulated from actual danger as it is possible to be, while still having bodies that respond to threat simulations. The hook story lands into that context and activates the system and produces the reward, and the safety of the context is not incidental to this. It is the whole condition that makes the reward available. When the same story traveled, as it did, and as every good story does, into settings that were less obviously safe, it produced a different quality of experience. A teenager hearing the hook story for the first time while actually parked in a car on a dark road, or walking home alone after a late shift, would not have found the aftermath as warm or as pleasant. The nervous system would have had less certainty that the threat was simulated, and the simulation would have shaded towards something else. This is why the hook story has always lived most comfortably at slumber parties and campfires, and later, in brightly lit computer labs, and in the blue glow of a screen in a bedroom with the door closed. In places where the contrast between the story's dark scenario and the actual safety of the listener's surroundings is at its widest and most reassuring. The story needs that contrast to do its best work. There is something in Arthur Aaron's findings about shared arousal and interpersonal closeness that extends beyond the slumber party into the longer social life of the hook story. A story that has been told for 60 years, that has passed through millions of tellers and millions of listeners, that has been adapted and refined and carried across every available medium. That story is in some aggregate sense a shared experience of enormous scope. Every person who ever heard the hook story and was briefly pleasurably frightened by it, and then recovered from that fright in the company of people they trusted, is part of a community defined by that shared experience. They do not know each other. They are separated by decades and by geography, but they have all been through the same room, in a sense, and come out the other side together. This is one of the things stories do that is hard to measure but impossible to ignore. They create horizontal connection across time, not the vertical connection of parent to child or teacher to student, but the sideways connection of people who have passed through the same door in the same direction and found the same room on the other side. A girl at a slumber party in Ohio in 1968 who heard the Hook story for the first time is connected by that experience to a girl at a similar party in Texas in 1974 and to a boy reading the story on a computer screen in 1993 and to a teenager with a phone in a dark bedroom in 2019. None of them know each other. None of them could trace the connection, but the story moved through all of them and changed them in the same small way, producing the same brief alarm and the same returning warmth. And in that sense, they share something specific. That is not a small thing to share. The Hook story itself is in its bones a simple story. A couple, a car, a dark road, a threat that came close without completing itself, the evidence left behind on the door. These are not complex elements. The story takes perhaps 3 minutes to tell well. It has no characters in the literary sense. It has no theme in the explicit sense. And yet it has persisted in recognizable form for the better part of a century, traveling through every medium available to it, adapting to new contexts without losing the essential shape that makes it work. This persistence is not an accident of cultural inertia. It is the result of genuine fitness, of a story that is precisely suited to the work it does, and that continues to find new audiences who need that work done and who are glad afterward that it was. The threat simulation system that Revansuo identified is not a relic. It is active in every person reading or hearing this story, now, in whatever room they are in, with whatever light is on or off, with whatever quiet has settled around them in this late part of the evening. The system is old. It has been running in the human animal for as long as the human animal has been sitting in circles around fires in the dark, telling each other what to be careful of, and practicing, through the telling, the careful attention that might one day be needed. The Hook story is a very recent addition to that long tradition. It arrived in the middle of the 20th century and found a world of cars and drive-ins and dark roads and teenagers with new freedoms and old anxieties, and it made itself at home, and then it kept traveling. Through the slumber parties and the campfires and the columns in the national newspapers and the photocopied pages passed between high school lockers and the early internet forums where people typed it out from memory, and the wikis where it was archived alongside hundreds of other stories, shared its basic function. At every stop it shed some detail and picked up another. The hook became claw marks in some versions, and then became a hook again. The radio announcement changed to fit the local station. The road had a different name in every town that claimed it as their own, but the couple was always there, and the car, and the dark, and the thing outside the window that they did not quite see, and the evidence in the morning that confirmed they had been right to leave. The story stayed the same by changing exactly as much as it needed to. There is a particular quality to the moment when a nervous system releases fear that has been safely held. Neuroscientists describe it in terms of chemical transition, the cortisol and adrenaline of the arousal phase giving way to the oxytocin and dopamine of the recovery phase, the body moving from alert to at rest and releasing, in that transition, a cocktail of signals that produce the feeling of warmth and closeness and mild euphoria that has always followed a good scare in a safe room. The chemistry is real, the experience it produces is real, but the description, accurate as it is, leaves something out. What it leaves out is the quality of the room in those moments, the way the air changes, the way voices sound slightly different than they did before the story started, the way someone's laugh is a little too loud and no one minds, the way the circle on the sleeping bags reforms, slightly tighter, the gaps between people slightly smaller than they were before. These are real physical facts about what happens when a group of people are frightened together and then released from the fright together, and the chemistry explains them, and the chemistry is true, but the feeling of them is something that the chemistry does not quite reach. The feeling is something more like the world had an edge, and we went close to it and came back, and the room on this side of it is the same room it was before, but it feels different now, more specifically itself, more clearly here. The hook on the car door was outside. Everything in this room is inside, and inside, right now, is enough. That feeling, so small, so temporary, so reliably produced by so simple a mechanism, is the thing the Hook story has been delivering to listeners for the entirety of its existence. Not fear, exactly, not its opposite either. The specific warmth that waits on the far side of fear when the fear has been held in a safe place and released on schedule. The story has been delivering that feeling to girls on sleeping bags, and boys at campfires, and readers at terminals, and listeners in dark bedrooms for longer than most people alive can remember, and it has not once needed to be anything other than exactly what it is to do it. The couple is always in the car. The night is always dark. The road is always a road no one would choose if they had another option. And the hook, or the claw marks, or the particular scratch along the lower edge of the chrome handle that no one can explain with certainty. That detail is always there in the morning, quiet and ordinary and small, evidence of something that came close and did not complete itself. And in the room where someone is hearing this, the walls are still where they were,